I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's October 21st, and we have a lot to talk about. Just about a month ago, 9,600 researchers, clinicians, and representatives from patient advocacy organizations gathered in Barcelona for the European Committee on Treatment and Research in MS Annual Scientific Congress, better known as ECTRIMS, the largest MS research conference in the world. One of the major topics of this year's meeting was the updated criteria used to diagnose MS, known as the McDonald criteria. And if you're looking for an illustration of how progress in MS research improves the quality of MS care, I think the McDonald criteria is an ideal example. The first version of the McDonald criteria was introduced in 2001, and in 2001, the average time it took to get an MS diagnosis was 4 years. The McDonald criteria was updated in 2005, and the average time to an MS diagnosis was 3.5 years. The McDonald criteria was updated again in 2010, and the average time to an MS diagnosis was 2.75 years. In 2020, the fourth revision of the McDonald criteria was published, and the average time to an MS diagnosis was 1 year. The fifth update of the McDonald criteria was published last month, and the average time to an MS diagnosis is now 3 to 6 months. And that's what progress looks like. The sheer amount of research presented at ECTRIMS requires lots of homework, reading abstracts and watching video presentations after the meeting ends. Now that he's had an opportunity to look back at his notes and digest all of the science presented at ECTRIMS 2025, the National MS Society's Executive Vice President of Research, Dr. Bruce Bebo, returns to this podcast to take us on a deep dive covering some of the most important research presented this year. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. Bebo, there are a few other things that you should know about. In last week's episode of the podcast, Janish Hanslick shared her experience as the first patient in the world to receive CAR T-cell therapy for MS. CAR T-cell therapy is already in use for treating some cancers, and one of the things to know about CAR T-cell therapy is that it's incredibly expensive. In the United States, the cost of the therapy alone ranges between $370,000 and $475,000. And once you add in the necessary additional costs associated with this treatment, including hospitalization, tests, procedures, and other expenses, the total cost can exceed $1 million. Which is why it was very encouraging to read last week's announcement that biotech company Kernal Biologics had received a grant of up to $48 million to accelerate the development of their next-generation CAR T-cell therapy for MS and B-cell blood cancers, which the company claims can reduce the cost of this treatment by as much as 100-fold, making that $475,000 treatment a $4,750 treatment. In standard CAR T-cell treatment, blood is taken from the patient or a healthy donor, much as you would facilitate a blood donation. This blood is sent to a lab where the white blood cells, or T cells, are separated out and reprogrammed to carry a receptor designed to fight a particular condition. This receptor is known as a chimeric antigen receptor, which is often referred to by the acronym CAR or CAR. Over the course of several weeks in the lab, these fortified T cells multiply until there are millions of them, and then they're reintroduced to the patient through an intravenous infusion. Kernal's treatment, called KR402, uses Kernal Biologics' mRNA platform, where a molecule containing instructions for making a chimeric antigen receptor that targets B cells is delivered to patients. So unlike all the other CAR T-cell therapies available today, This therapy works inside the patient's body, which eliminates two major steps in current CAR T-cell therapy: the collection and reinfusion of engineered T-cells, and the use of chemotherapy to delete the immune system before treatment to support the survival of those CAR T-cells that are introduced into the patient. The $48 million grant from the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health's Embody program will be used to create mRNA molecules for in-body CAR T therapies, develop new manufacturing strategies for these therapies, and create preclinical models to evaluate the treatment's safety and effectiveness. Kernel Biologics will be collaborating with researchers at the Stanford University School of Medicine, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and the Jackson Laboratory to conduct this work. And we'll keep you updated on their progress as it's announced. A bladder condition called neurogenic detrusor overactivity increases pressure inside the bladder and reduces the amount of urine it can hold, leading to urinary urgency, frequent urination, and urine leakage. Over time, it also increases the risk of urinary tract infections and even kidney damage. This condition is caused by a disruption in the nerve signals that control bladder function, causing that detrusor muscle around the bladder to contract uncontrollably. And this is, unfortunately, a well-known issue for many people living with MS or spinal cord injury. Well, I think it's fairly obvious that this condition isn't physically comfortable, but it can also interfere with everyday social engagement and affect your psychological well-being. That's why the FDA has granted fast-track designation to EG110A, a DNA-based therapy from biotech company EG427 that's designed to treat neurogenic detrusor overactivity. EG110A uses a harmless form of the herpes simplex virus type 1 to deliver DNA instructions to sensory neurons that detect the bladder filling. These DNA instructions enable these sensory neurons to produce a modified fragment of botulinum toxin type F. This toxin keeps those nerve cells from releasing the chemical messengers that drive that muscle contraction. EG110A has been shown to be effective in treating lab rats with overactive bladders, and the botulinum toxin type F has been shown to be as safe as botulinum toxin type A, which is much better known as Botox. EG110A is currently in clinical trials, and the first patient to have received treatment reduced their urinary incontinence episodes by more than 88% after 12 weeks, with improvements that were noted after just 4 weeks. Well, there's ongoing work taking place as these clinical trials continue, but this therapy seems well deserving of its fast-track designation. Stay tuned for further developments. The Valhalla Foundation has awarded Octave Bioscience a research grant to fund the development of a blood test that will detect disease progression in someone with MS. As many of you know from conversations you've probably had with your own neurologist, there really isn't a great way to measure MS progression. Today, determining progression relies on subjective clinical scales and MRI scans that often fail to detect early signs of progression. This grant will allow Octave to conduct studies to identify individual proteins that may serve as biomarkers of progression. Then, Octave plans to develop an artificial intelligence-based model that analyzes several blood biomarkers to produce a progression score. This score will help clinicians track MS progression and make earlier and more informed adjustments to treatment plans when necessary, ushering in an era of more personalized MS treatment. We'll keep you updated as Octave shares progress in this project. Over the past several years, many of you have downloaded and used the RealTalk MS app for your iOS or Android devices. So I want to give you a heads up that the developer of that app is getting out of the app business and will stop supporting the app at the end of this month. So we're pulling it from the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store, but the plan is to have a new and improved app available very, very soon. So you have my apologies in advance if the app you rely on to follow this show stops working for you. The good news is that this is a temporary situation, and we'll be back soon with a new app that I promise will be even better than the one you may be using today. If you haven't had a chance, I hope you'll find time to visit the Real Talk MS YouTube channel and check out our ECTRIMS extra videos featuring my conversations with some of the top MS researchers in the world at ECTRIMS 2025. You'll find a link to that YouTube playlist in today's show notes. And while we're talking about ECTRIMS, it seems like the ideal time to welcome Dr. Bruce Bebo back to the podcast for a deep dive into some of the most important research presented at ECTRIMS 2025. Less than a month ago, I was sitting outside of a conference center in Barcelona, Spain, minutes after ECTRIMS, the largest MS research conference in the world, had ended, and has become an annual tradition. The National MS Society's Executive Vice President of Research, Dr. Bruce Bebo, was with me, sharing his initial thoughts about some of the research that was presented during the conference. If you haven't yet heard our conversation, I'll invite you to check out episode 422 of Real Talk MS, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. Now, during our conversation, Bruce and I planned to reconnect for this follow-up after he'd had a chance to review and digest the enormous amount of information that came out of the ECTRIMS meeting. And so, here we are. Welcome back to the podcast, Bruce.
Hi, John. As always, good to be with you.
ECTRIMS is the largest MS-focused meeting in the world. What made this year's theme, A New Era of Precision, so timely?
Right. So this year, there were more than 9,600 researchers, healthcare providers, and advocates from 120 different countries that were gathered in Barcelona to explore the latest scientific discoveries and advances in care for MS. And as you said, the meeting's theme was a new era of precision. And this really reflects the growing momentum that I see that towards more personalized approaches to the management of MS. There are emerging fluid and imaging and digital biomarkers that are really starting to help healthcare providers tailor treatments more accurately and help predict outcomes for people living with MS.
Were there any clinical trial breakthroughs announced at this year's meeting?
There were a few, John. Let's talk about one that was presented by Dr. Gavin Giovannoni from the United Kingdom. And Dr. Giovannoni presented results from a phase 3 study called Oratorio Hand. They like to use a music theme for this particular platform. Now, this trial evaluated ocrelizumab or Ocrevus in more than 1,000 people that had primary progressive MS. Now, the participants in this trial were older. They could be up to 65 years old, and they had greater disability than many other trials, including many people in the trial that required wheelchairs to get around. So compared with the placebo, the people or participants in ocrelizumab group showed significantly slower disability progression when they measure this by the Expanded Disability Status Scale, or EDSS, and they had less loss of arm and hand function that they assessed using this 9-hole peg test I bet many of your listeners are familiar with. So really, one of the things I think was really notable about this study was the greatest benefit was observed in the participants who used wheelchairs. And this really underscores this treatment's potential value for individuals that have more advanced MS. Preserving upper limb function would be really especially important for people with limited mobility, as it, of course, helps people maintain independence and quality of life. And it may be interesting to share that this study built on a number of other studies that were catalyzed by an investment the society made many years ago called the Promise 2010 campaign. Another one, John, that I think you and your listeners would be interested in was a study presented by Nick Cuniff, who presented results from a phase 2 trial showing that a combination of two existing drugs, the diabetes medication metformin and the antihistamine clemastine, may promote myelin repair in people with relapsing remitting MS over 6 months of treatment. So this was a smaller study. This included 67 participants, and the observed benefit was based on improvements in a test called visual evoked potentials. This is a test that measures how quickly nerve signals travel from the eyes, from the retina to the visual centers in the brain. And it built upon earlier research that showed that clemastine alone can enhance myelin repair. So the good news is that they are able to repeat the results from a previous style of clemastine. Maybe the less good news was that the combination of the two didn't yield any more improvements in disability or in vision than the clemastine group on its own. But I think that's just a study that adds to a growing body of research focused on repairing myelin. And I think this gives a lot of hope that future therapies are going to come to us that'll be safe and effective and restore myelin and nerve function in people with MS.
Last year at ECTRIMS, we heard an awful lot about BTK inhibitors. Was there any news about BTK inhibitors this year?
Yep, sure was. And this is a really emerging, exciting area of research in MS. A little bit about what BTK inhibitors are. So these are drugs. They're small molecules, and they would be taken by mouth. They work by blocking an enzyme called Bruton's tyrosine kinase. That's where the BTK comes from. And this is a signaling molecule that helps activate immune cells that are responsible for driving inflammation and driving the nerve damage in MS. So blocking something like this theoretically would have benefits for people with MS. So this year's meeting, Dr. Heinz Wiendl, who's from Germany, highlighted and discussed the 5 different BTK inhibitors that are currently in clinical trials. Now, what I took away from this, John, was these all target the same enzyme, but they're very different, let's say, pharmacologically. So they're different in how effectively they get to the nervous system. They're different in how long they stay active in the blood, among many other things that is going to influence both the safety and effectiveness of the members of this class of medication. So I'll talk about 2 today that were presented last month at the meeting. The first one, tolebrutinib, which you mentioned. This is the one that's farthest along. It's now under review by the FDA and the EMA as a treatment for non-relapsing secondary progressive MS. Dr. Robert Fox from the Cleveland Clinic and Drs. Patrick Vermeersch from France showed that tolebrutinib had consistent benefits across different patient groups and had a modest but meaningful improvement in daily functioning. Another compound, the next one in the pipeline, if you will, fenebrutinib, also showed really strong results. So Dr. Ji-Won Oh from Toronto, Canada, reported that people who continued on fenebrutinib for 2 years maintained near complete suppression of disease activity. And this really supports the potential as a long-term treatment option. So to me, John, these studies underscore that growing momentum behind BTK inhibitors as the next generation approach to controlling inflammation and hopefully protecting nervous system in MS.
When people think about MS, cognitive changes are often overlooked. What new studies on cognition in MS were presented at this year's meeting?
Yeah, thanks for that. And really important question, John. So cognitive changes are one of the most common yet overlooked symptoms of MS. And in the opening section of ECTRIMS, where everybody's in the same room, Dr. Maria Pia Amato from Italy emphasized and shared that nearly half of people with MS at some point in their journey with MS experience some level of cognitive decline. It can happen early in the disease, and she urged clinicians to prioritize cognitive health just as much as physical symptoms. So there are several new studies that expanded on the theme. A study from Turkey that found that cognitive changes can appear more than a year before physical decline, suggesting they may serve as an early marker of disease progression. Another study from the Netherlands used machine learning to identify 3 distinct cognitive types or phenotypes, which could clearly predict how cognitive and physical symptoms evolve over time. And another study from a different institution in the Netherlands reported that most cognitive decline occurs independently of relapses. So this is a new term. We've talked about PIRA before, John, progression independent of relapse activity. So they coined this sort of cognitive PIRA. So something else to remember. Again, all of these studies and what we're learning and what's in the scientific literature really reshaping how researchers and clinicians understand progression and highlighting that we really need to protect and monitor cognitive health at every stage of the disease.
Just a few weeks before ECTRIMS, the updated diagnostic criteria for diagnosing MS, the McDonald criteria, were published. And that was certainly the buzz during the meeting. How will these new criteria speed up someone getting a diagnosis?
Yeah, great question. And really, it was a highlight of the meeting this year, the publication and a number of studies illustrating how the diagnostic criteria are going to change how we diagnose the disease. So the updated diagnostic criteria are already showing some real world impacts. So there was a study from Dr. Luca Bolo in Spain that used the new criteria, applied them to a cohort of individuals at his institution. And he reported that the diagnosis of MS increased from 50% to 72% and shortened the diagnosis time by about 6 months. Another study from Dr. Wallace Brownlee, who's in the United Kingdom, reported that diagnosis in the cohort he studied rose from 63% to 80%, and decisions took only 40 days, which is about half the time that was needed with the older criteria. And we're pushing this diagnosis earlier and earlier, John. And I think on that sort of topic, there were other presentations that were looking for markers even before diagnosis. So I did share a couple of what I think were super interesting studies. So a study from UCSF identified blood-based protein biomarkers that signal inflammation, myelin damage, and nerve injury. Listen to this, up to 7 or 8 years before symptoms appeared.
Wow.
So this is more evidence that there's this prodromal period, a period where there's disease activity that's subclinical, that can manifest at times in symptoms that aren't really specific to MS, but are starting to tell us something's going on. And I'm really optimistic we're going to be able to leverage this study and others to even identify people at high risk for MS and get them screened for the diagnosis of MS using the new criteria. There's another study from Canada that showed that you could combine polygenic risk scores. So we know a lot about the genetic component to the risk for MS. So we could develop these polygenic risk scores and add that to a family history. And that can also add to these observations about blood biomarkers and other kinds of markers to improve the accuracy of who could predict who may develop MS.
Over the last few years, we've certainly seen more of a focus on lifestyle options, changes people can make on their own without any sort of pharmacological intervention that actually improve their quality of life. Was there anything in terms of diet and wellness that was presented at ECTRIMS?
Yeah, sure was. And I think the takeaway is diet matters. So one study looked at high intake of ultra-processed foods, foods that and this consumption of high ultra-processed foods was linked to more relapses. There was another study looking at the MIND diet, which is a Mediterranean-based diet, that showed there were benefits of this diet to fatigue and quality of life. So let's dig into this ultra-processed food story a little bit. So this is a study from Gloria Della Costa in the United States, and she presented this evidence linking these ultra-processed foods. So these are things like packaged snacks, fast food, other really highly processed items, linking that to worsening MS outcomes. So she used data from a trial involving people experiencing their first MS-related episode, and her team found that those who ate most ultra-processed foods had more relapses and larger and more active brain lesions. And these findings really, in my mind, reinforce that diet matters. Does suggest that cutting back on ultra-processed foods could be a simple, safe way to support early MS management alongside standard treatments. Also something, John, we should all be doing, right? Let me tell you a little bit about this MIND diet. So this is a blend of the Mediterranean and the DASH diets. It's really focused on protecting brain health. The study that was presented last month showed that over 6 years, people with MS who followed this MIND diet more closely reported less disability, less fatigue, and better quality of life. Of course, we need more research. These results highlight the potential of brain healthy eating for long-term MS wellness. And the society is currently funding a randomized trial to further test this MIND diet's impact on brain health and symptoms. And I have one more. This was from Dr. Lindsay Woolscroft, who's from the United States. She was looking at whether exercise can actually promote myelin repair. So she performed a small study over 6 months in people who exercise moderately 3 times a week. And she showed measurable increases in myelin repair in certain regions of the brain. It's very early. It's not a definitive study, but it does point to the biological benefits of staying active. So altogether, John, all of these studies, I think, show and accumulating evidence is showing that lifestyle changes, eating healthier, getting regular exercise, doing it early during the course of MS can really play a powerful role in managing MS and supporting brain health.
I remember last year at ECTRIMS, there was a call for more of a focus on the impact of MS on women's health issues in particular. I'm wondering whether you saw or heard any studies that sort of reflected that focus.
Sure did, John. Maybe to start with, we're inspired by that meeting last year and other meetings to issue the society to issue a specific call for applications on the topic of women's health and MS. And we're right now in the middle of adjudicating, reviewing those, and we'll be funding some targeted research on that topic. And there were a couple of studies I'd like to highlight at ECTRIMS last month on that topic. So the first one was performed by a group in Turkey, and they studied nearly 600 people with MS. And they found that symptom patterns differ before and after menopause. So before menopause, women were more likely to experience optic nerve involvement and having their vision affected, while spinal cord symptoms were more common after menopause. The types of comorbidities or other conditions later on top of MS also shifted. So psychiatric conditions like depression and anxiety were more frequent before menopause, while cardiovascular issues became more common afterwards. So I think these findings really highlight the importance of a personalized approach to care that accounts for hormonal changes across a woman's lifespan. Another study I'd highlight from Dr. Riley Beauvais at the University of California, San Francisco found that while menopause didn't appear to worsen MS-related brain changes looking at MRI images, it was linked to greater volume loss in brain regions tied to cognition. So we can measure the rate at the brain shrinkage or brain atrophy, and there was a greater loss of volume in those areas of the brain that are linked to cognition in women after menopause. So I think these are maybe early days, John, in our understanding of how hormones across a woman's lifespan affect their quality of life and affect the biology of MS. And we're, as I mentioned, making targeted investments, and others are making targeted investments so we can learn more.
When people talk about artificial intelligence, it's often framed as something that's going to be important in the future. But it certainly feels like AI is already here. Many MS researchers are already using forms of AI like machine learning in their work. Did you find that AI had a presence at ECTRIMS?
Absolutely, John. And it's hard to understate the promise of this new technology and what it can do for our understanding of what's driving MS and treatment of MS. And there were many, many different presentations. It's hard to talk about one specifically, John, because it permeated the whole meeting. I can share my thoughts around AI. I think using this technology and applying it to health system data could help us identify people who are at high risk for MS by looking at their interactions with the healthcare system. There have been published data on this already that I think as we are able to evaluate larger sets of data and learn more, that we can use this technology to help us pick people out, if you will, from healthcare system data that are at high risk for MS and start getting them screened using the new diagnostic criteria. See how it all fits together? Using the new diagnostic criteria to get people diagnosed earlier. AI has a promise of measuring the underlying biology driving MS in individuals and understanding what that biology is, and then helping healthcare providers make decisions around the best therapy that addresses that biology. So it's going to reveal insights that are going to lead to precision medicine. All of the pharma companies that are developing therapies for all kinds of conditions, but particularly in MS, are using AI to help identify novel molecules and pathways that can be leveraged for new treatments. They're helping identify biomarkers that could, again, help diagnose MS, help understand the underlying biology driving disease in individual people, and identifying new treatments that address that biology. I think this is a field that is changing so fast and is incredibly exciting for MS and for many other health conditions as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, Dr. Bruce Bebo, thank you once again for breaking down the largest MS research conference in the world into easy to digest pieces. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
Yeah, thanks, John. Always good to be with you.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/425. You'll find that link in today's show notes so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. Next week, you're going to meet someone who works in the healthcare insurance industry, who thought they understood how things worked in that industry. That is, until their daughter was diagnosed with MS and prescribed a high-efficacy disease-modifying therapy. That was the beginning of an insurance nightmare that I know many of you will relate to. I hope you'll join me next week for an eye-opening, jaw-dropping conversation, along with all the news that people affected by MS need to know. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.